I'm Professor Amelia Hadfield. I'm from the University of Surrey, where I'm head of politics, and also Dean International. And it's an absolute delight, as it always is, to be back at UACIS. Been a member of UACIS since 2003. It's probably some of you not even born then, I don't know. So it's great to see how incredibly vibrant the student conferences, the Student Research Forum. And I think the papers we have today, I'm really looking forward to hearing from them. I think they look exceptionally interesting. So I'm delighted to be chairing and discussing the panel, Work, Education and Technology in the European Union. So we're going to move over now to Diego and Peter's paper. I'm not sure if you're going to do sort of a Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire sort of setup. I'll leave that to you. The title of the paper is Framing the Policy Response on Digital Dependence. Take it away, gentlemen.
All right. Our topic is framing your policy response on digital dependence. Just a short introduction. Me and Peter were a colleague in both studying, finalizing actually our master studies at the University of Siena, Italy, respectively me on European studies and Peter in public diplomacy. And actually this work is partially part of our master thesis. So, and it came in a context when recently EU is trying to launch a big bank of policy initiative and proposal, trying to address the digital sector, mainly the dependencies and all the comes from those concerns. First of all, I actually prepared the slides with one of the book, which is published in 2017. I assume some of you might heard about it, of Neil Ferguson, the historian, called the Square and the Tower. And what he refers to, and take this symbolic analogy to try to give a sense of how the hierarchical political structure and the networks, social networks, have interacted over the time, and how a political power, a political structure, tries to dominate over the digital, over the network. And specifically, we're trying to find some light of this concept on the digital sphere. So we are certainly in position when the digital evolution have brought some very radical challenges, and also benefits when it comes to our daily lives, in economy, in social space, but politics. Some of them, one of the main features of digital revolution is datafication, or the idea that everything is now translated in a way on data, and data use served as one of the main source of designing economic structure, but also when it comes to decision making. Change obviously the business models, the economic structure of countries, but also implies major implication when it comes also to public services. When it comes to EU stance, EU consider a very important development, the digital revolution, and find it as a deeply shaping 21st century, and the data are the most important source of this new revolution. And but when it comes to data, and also to the companies which are mainly shaping the digital environment, they are mostly based on the US, but also in China. And in that perspective, we have been noticed a tension which came from the fact that mostly of the data storage are based on US, and basically specifically in Silicon Valley, and how they imply strategic implication for the EU. What how the way how the digital revolution comes and emerge in condition which we are now, we can observe that we are certainly a stage of a very deep integration of digital sector, and also which might lead, in the case of EU, to dependencies. To try to grasp some a view of dependence to digital sector, we'll be referring to literature of international political economy and trying to understand how scholars over time have defined the dependence and the interdependence. And the two main concepts of the degree of dependence, we're referring to Robert Cohen and Joseph Nye on their book Power and Dependence, which they try to make a distinguish between sensitivity and vulnerability. So with sensitivity, that means that involves a degree of responsiveness within a policy framework, and how quickly do change in one country bring costly change in another, and how great are the costly effects. And on the other side, vulnerability can define as actors' liability to suffer cost imposed by external events, even after policies have been altered. And an attempt to understand the strategy implication, and also to be more focused on the digital dependence, we try to define it as a situation of condition which is to be exposed to strategic vulnerabilities and the lacking of capabilities and instrument to make decisions in digital realm. All these policy initiative and action by the European Union have mainly four main drivers, or known as 4 Cs, which are culture, control, competition, and cybersecurity. Culture refers to the assumption that Europe is different from other parts of the world in defending the values, and also defending the value referring to solidarity and market regulation. The control, which is a fragile point when it comes to technological sovereignty, arguing that the EU or individual member states need to have policy instruments to control the outcomes of the digital economy in general, and how citizens and companies use more digital service. The third, competition, which is another viewpoint which collect different thoughts and consideration around industrial competitiveness, the future capacity of European multinational enterprises to compete on the world markets, and fear about declining European influence vis-a-vis other standard-setting powers. And the fourth, cybersecurity, and that this point is a growing demand for new policies to protect personal but even business data, and have at disposal all the tools and technologies necessary to protect digital integrity and digital resilience. So in such a context, we try to draw 3 main line or arguments to structure all this policy initiative on institutionalization, capacity building, and also try to grasp some key some features of a fragmented digital single market, how it applies in mid and long term strategic implication. So in such tensions, we divide the current condition and also the complementarities. By complementarities, we try to give a sense of what EU is trying to balance or to rebalance in order to reduce this gap, not when it comes to legal infrastructure, but also to align that with the European values. And also, we put it in a framework which we define as a goal-oriented and based on also ideas, which are a value-centric approach. And to grasp some empirical data, we analyzed 2 of the main legislation package, which is the Digital Service Act and also the Digital Market Act. The Digital Service Act actually is focused mainly on the consumer side. It tries to regulate areas regarding the online service, news, connectivity, health, wellness, and also access to the market. And it tried to underline some other aspects such as European public goods, and to give more access to transparency and accountability on digital sector, and also to give a higher sense of responsibility and accountability to the big tech giants. And if you have a look on the major issues which Digital Single Act try to address, the main targets are very large platforms. We divide it in 4 main targets, which are intermediary service, hosting service, online platforms, and very large platforms. And what we see is that very large platforms are actually the most target ones. According to Digital Market Act, it mainly try to regulate market in terms of reducing imbalances and fragmentation, and give more responsibility to the so-called gatekeepers, which have mainly stand in a monopoly position. But also it is not only in terms of regulation, but tries also to scale up the European small and medium enterprises, and also to provide to them a digital infrastructure and a higher level of accessibility. On the same time, EU is trying also to export these values and this model of regulation, especially in digital therein, and started to take action even in international scale, and particularly by trying to open, and actually has opened the negotiation on e-commerce in the World Trade Organization. And if you have a look on the EU proposal, on concrete proposal when it comes to e-commerce on World Trade Organization, we can notice that they are strictly try to expand in scale and scope the digital regulation, and mainly to try to build the international digital regime, which seems to, in Europe perspective, to have winners on all the sides, and also to institutionalize through World Trade Organization. When it comes to capacity building, we can notice that the major aspect is the investment on Gaia X, which is a federated data infrastructure for Europe, and it is trying to give not only try to hold the data, European data, to provide to them the ability to access, control, and also manipulate data to more technological innovation, and also AI development. And specifically Gaia X has taken an important relevance when it comes to, when you see in multi-annual financial framework for 2021 to 2027, and also have taken an important attention even in recovery funds, and also on green transition, and how the EU to line and this.
Diego, I'm just going to give you just a 1 minute warning if you can bring it into a conclusion. Thank you.
But it's so difficult when if you have a look on the digital economy and next on the last one, 2020, you can see the difference. Southern countries are still huge on the 4 main indicators, such as connectivity, human capital, use of internet service, integration of digital public. So this fragmentation and divergences within the digital single market might lead and actually is threatened by major implications, such as a higher degree of monopolies and inequalities, geotechnology, but also the ability of the EU to expand this regulation outside in international scale. And we came out at the end by few recommendations, in particular trying to put an emphasis on more concrete measure on deepening and integration of digital single market. And when it comes to international cooperation on digital realm, might be necessary to try to agree on consensus on World Trade Organization by specific issue targets in order to advance the negotiations. As it seems till now, agreement on digital realms seems very utopic. So that was pretty much, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Diego. Some very insightful stuff here. Definitely want to hear more about the federated data infrastructure. So we're going to move over now to panelist number 3, Dr. Christiana Antonoudiou. I hope that I'm pronouncing that right, Christiana. And the title of your paper, The EU Regulation of Sustainable Jobs in the Post-Pandemic Era, Employment Security and Economic Dismissals.
The topic that I'm going to present you today is the EU regulation of sustainable jobs in the post-pandemic era. And in particular, I'm going to talk about employment security and economic dismissals. This was part of my PhD thesis that I defended last year. I did my PhD at University of Bristol. However, I had to adjust these ideas to the current situation, to the trembling era that we're now facing. So in my second slide that you cannot see now, I set out Eurostat statistics which indicate a sharp increase of the rate of unemployment during the pandemic crisis. So the question that needs to be raised is how we would be able to tackle unemployment after the COVID era, and how the EU regulates the economic dismissals and also protects workers and employers in the spectrum. Now, first of all, I think it's important to get an understanding of employment security. What does employment security mean? What's the difference between employment security and job security from a flexicurity perspective? And why does this terminological analysis matter? Well, as I realized, there is a confusion, a terminological confusion of employment security. In the European Commission's communication of 2007, job security appears as security of a particular job, so to retain a particular job, whereas employment security appears as the idea of remaining in the labor market. However, many scholars have decided different terminological interpretation of the concept of employment security. So, for example, Peter Auer in his paper of 2010 explained job security as a security in the current job of a particular job, whereas employment security appears as the idea of securing employment with the current employer, which refers to the idea of multiple jobs. Also, Nuna Zekic, in his paper of 2016, which I think is an inspiring paper, describes employment security as the individual's ability to remain in the labor market, which depends on their employability, whereas job security takes the meaning of the continuity of one's current employment. So now, in the realm of the EU, employment security appears as the idea of entering, remaining, and re-entering the labor market. Now, from a flexicurity perspective, and first of all, what flexicurity means? Flexicurity is a nexus of flexibility and security. Its origins stems from Dutch and Danish models. The Danish model is also known as the Golden Triangle. In the Council conclusions of 2007, The Council describes flexicurity as a means to create more and better jobs. I think it's really interesting, the EC communication of 2007, which actually sets out the core aims of flexicurity and describes very clearly that there is a need to facilitate a shift from job security to employment security. Now, flexicurity has two aims. The one is to provide labor market flexibility, and on the other hand, to provide labor market security to all workers and employers. And also, in order to make flexicurity national pathways a reality, it's important, according to the European Communication Statement, to adopt 4 mutually supportive components. These 4 are the following: the flexible and reliable contractual arrangements, the comprehensive lifelong learning strategies, the effective active labor market policies, also known as ALMPS, and the modern social security systems. So it's important for each member state to adopt its own national flexicurity pathway that will reflect its national challenges and realities as labor market from country to country faces different issues. Now, as many scholars have noted, and also the European Commission, there are some issues between the components of flexibility and security. Flexicurity is an equilibrium between flexibility and security, and there is a tendency to give priority to flexibility over security. 2 examples of lack of this equilibrium: the one is the over flexibilization of job security procedures, and the other one is the rigidities of dismissal procedures. Now, as we have now understood, I hope, we have understood what employment security means in the European Union's context, I set out the regulation of economic dismissals because I thought that during that time, during the COVID era, it's very important to understand how the EU regulates through its hard law means of regulation the economic dismissals. There are actually 3 directives. The one is the Collective Redundancies Directive, 98 of 59. The other one is the Transfer of Undertakings Directive. It's the Directive 2001 of 23. And the other one is the Insolvency Protection Directive, which is the 2008 of 94. Now, I'm going to say a few words about each directive. In regards to Collective Redundancies Directive, it sets out normal requirements that shall be met through the collective redundancy procedures. It sets out the definition of collective redundancy. It explicitly notes that dismissal shall be effected by an employer for one or more reasons not related to the individual workers concerned, and also sets out a few other procedural safeguards. Now, I chose a case for you, which I think is very important. This case is the Ayeti Raklis. It was a case which was referred, it was a request which was referred by a Greek court to the ECJ. It's the case 2001 of 15. I found that this case says a lot because in that case, the court examined whether 3 substantive criteria could refrain employers' decision from effective collective redundancies. These substantive criteria are the following: the conditions in the labor market, the situation of the undertaking, and the interests of the national economy. What the court said is that, yes, the member state is eligible to adopt the substantive criteria legislation, however, only if does not derive directly from its practical effect. So I think this is a key limitation to the wording, to the protection of worker in this realm. About the Transfer of Undertakings Directive 2001 of 23, the core aim of that directive is to provide employment protection in the event of transfer of undertaking, business, or part of the undertaking of business. Actually, this directive merely provides a job security protection because it protects workers from in case where there is an ETO reason. ETO means economic, technical, or organizational reason. Now, in regards to the Insolvency Protection Directive of 2008 of 94, this directive, to be honest, just provides employment security protection. It does not provide job security protection because this directive provides procedural safeguards for payment of employees' outstanding claims which resulted from employment relationships or employment contract in the event of insolvency of employer. So since we are talking about insolvency, then any safeguard there has to do with employment security rather than about retaining a particular job. In this realm, I chose the J.C. Van Ardenen case. It's the C-435 of 2010 case. I think this case is a landmark one. The court there stated that it would be contrary to the objectives of the directive to interpret Article 4 of the directive in such a way that an employee will be required to register as job seeker within a prescribed time period in the event of the insolvency of their employer in order to fully assert their right to payment of outstanding wage claims. So actually what it says is that the individual is not obliged to register as a job seeker. It will fully assert their right to payment of outstanding wage claims. I think this is a key protection, a key workers' protection. Now, apart from the hard law instruments that I've just described, there is also the European Employment Strategy. The European Employment Strategy, as you may know, is a soft law mechanism of the EU, which uses the open method of coordination. It has 4 stages. The one is the integrated employment guidelines, where they set out strategic aims for labor protection. It's the joint employment report, where they set out best and worst practices of implementation of the guidelines. And then there is a national reform program, and at last there is a country-specific recommendations. To be honest, I think that this was about to be more reflexive, more, how to say it, deliberative. However, what I noticed is that it's a dry and bureaucratic procedure. The state.
Christiana, sorry to interrupt. I'm going to get you to bring it into a conclusion if we can. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm very close. Thank you. So in the realm of the ES, we can spot that many times flexicurity is promoted in this context. And for example, in the proposal for a council decision guidelines, it set out that it's needed to reduce the barriers that businesses faces in hiring people. And at last, my concluding remarks, the first one is that the concept of employment security is a complex issue. That's clear. The second one is we may need to combine hard law and soft law means of regulation in order to provide adequate protection to workers and employers. And the last one is that we may need to develop the required means of regulation to facilitate a shift from jobs to employment security, which actually adjusts the job security in the spectrum. Thank you.
Christiana, thank you very much indeed. Very much enjoy that. And thank you very much for keeping to time. Marc. Right round again. Delighted to have you presenting your panel. I was going to make a pithy remark that it was a lost paper, but in fact, it's a lost generation, and I'm glad that you're with us. So over to you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Since changing the browser, it works better. Okay, I will try to keep it short as I already took up some time. So basically, I will now my paper, which deals with kind of the framework that the European Union developed for dealing with youth employment or youth unemployment as its opposite. And I kind of want to analyze and look at actually whether this framework, because it's often presented like this in politics, for instance, like the leader of the EPP, Manfred Weber, just claimed this last year. But this framework for youth employment policies often enough presented as an achievement of the last decade, so a major revolution in how the EU approaches youth employment. That the EU in itself actually approaches youth employment is already something. And so basically it's often presented like this, and kind of like I wanted to actually assess this claim and look at it and see, okay, on the one hand, what actually constitutes this framework for young people and young work? And on the other hand, is this really truly a revolution of the last decade, or do we see here more like a competence creep of the European Union that is actually not indicated in the treaties, but where the EU somehow has developed an activity or competence in youth employment policy in this regard? Before starting, I just would like to point to one distinction also that I'm not looking at today. So basically, if you think about young work, you can think about what Christiana just did with the directives. You can think about regulation of working conditions. That is not what I'm doing today in my PhD project. That is more broadly looking at the EU and young work. I'm also doing this, but today I'm more or less looking rather at the quantity and the availability of youth employment. So fighting youth unemployment in this regard. This is kind of really the focus of what this paper that I submitted here is actually about. And so basically the paper then kind of tries to look at whether the EU is an actor in youth employment policy, which elements constitute this framework, and also what I said before, whether this really was a major change in the last decade. Going through the paper and kind of like try to present the paper and also without the slides, I basically look at kind of three elements. The first is actually looking at the competence of the EU, because I think this is very important to also just underline what the EU can actually factually, according to the treaties, do. We will see this is not what it is doing. Maybe there are some boundary issues, and maybe the EU can often, but this is also quite well known in scholarship, that the EU often enough uses its competences in a quite of a creative manner, let's say it like this. Then I will look at the Euro crisis as a case in point where allegedly, as it's often said in political discourse, this framework was developed and like came about just like this from nowhere in the end, as it's claimed in politics. And then I try to assess here with the example of the European Youth Guarantee, but in the paper I'm also looking at the Youth Employment Initiative. I try to assess where this framework actually comes from, and that is actually not such a major change of the last decade. There have been important changes, obviously, but the framework is much, much older and has been actually more this historical contingency that led actually to this framework. If you just look quickly at the competences of the EU first, you will see that actually the term young worker or youth employment is only mentioned in Article 50 and Article 32 of the Charter. But Article 50 of the EU, which relates actually to free movement workers and which has never been applied since 1957, this article is there, kind of calls upon the member states to establish something like an exchange framework for young workers. Whatever this means has never been applied, and it's also not the focus of the paper now. Just to mention that the term is there, but actually if you look at the competence more broadly, there's nothing that would directly relate to youth employment, except maybe for the competences that the EU has on vocational training and education that are also called education, vocational training, youth and sport. But basically what the EU does there is more or less support the member states, if he put it bluntly here. So basically also not an important competence that the EU has there. But if you look at really what the EU can do in employment policy and social policy, which would relate more to the true regulation and setting of minimum standards on young work, there's actually not much. Maybe you could cite the European Social Fund, which is a finance instrument of the European Union, which will come back also later in this presentation, which you could imagine that it kind of could help actually youth employment through actually funding projects that kind of support youth employment, but it's also not mentioned clearly there, and there's no mentioning of any young workers or something like that. So So basically in the competences, there's no clear reference to young workers in the end, except for the one provision that has never been used, and it is probably not going to be used anytime soon or even in the future. Although it's astonishing that this provision has been there since 1957 and was never used. So if you look then as a second part of this presentation at the Euro crisis, what actually was proposed as this framework for youth employment, there's basically 3 levers that were kind of mentioned in the political discourse, but there's a 4th kind of hidden lever that also was quite important during the Euro crisis, about which I will also talk. First of all, the most important, or not the most important, but maybe the earliest mechanism that is also not a new mechanism in this regard was actually the Commission in 2010 said free movement of workers will be our solution to youth unemployment, because the young people, they will just move to another member state and work there, which is based on an old economic theory. And we have seen, although there was a spark and a rise up in youth unemployment, youth mobility, we actually have seen that this is not a solution, although claimed like this by the Commission. And it's quite interesting to see also, maybe also for other reasons, that free movement is probably not the best, probably the most appropriate tool in a pandemic. But we can actually see that with the new rise because of the pandemic in youth unemployment, that free movement is actually not mentioned anymore as a response to youth unemployment in this regard. But the 2 main means that were mentioned by the EU and that are also always politically acclaimed as these kind of revolutionary means are the European Youth Guarantee on the one hand, and on the other hand, the Youth Employment Initiative. What are these means actually about? So if you look at the Youth Employment Initiative, this is also where the European Social Fund comes back, because the Youth Employment Initiative is an endowment, so a certain sum of money within the European Social Fund that is dedicated or was dedicated only to fighting youth unemployment. So basically this initiative could finance projects in the member states that were most hardly hit, for instance, Greece, Spain, and Italy. There was a lot of projects financed through the Youth Employment Initiative that financed projects that it actually should work towards increasing the levels of available youth employment. So this is the one hand. But it's quite interesting to see as well that this Youth Employment Initiative was linked to the European Youth Guarantee, which is the second element that was claimed as being like a major change in how the European Union deals with young work. What is this European Youth Guarantee? Basically, it's kind of the idea of providing young persons, as soon as they become unemployed or exit education, with an alternative to being unemployed. So having training, finding other employment. And basically, it kind of should commit the member states to offering such an offer to young persons that fall under these cases within 4 months of either becoming unemployed or exiting education. And for this purpose, the kind of guarantee is kind of also a mechanism of coordination, because it sets out some means how the member states should actually achieve this objective. But what is important to know here is that the European Youth Guarantee is a recommendation by the Council, and in this sense cannot bind the member states, and the account of implementation of the Youth Guarantee has also quite diverse among the member states. Some of them took really great care in implementing the Youth Guarantee, others did not really change their policies at all. So this is also quite interesting to mention. And the fourth and a kind of obscure element of how the EU responded to youth unemployment in the Euro crisis is actually also austerity, and this is what is not mentioned by the EU. And it's quite interesting just to mention this here briefly, because they're quite an opposed tendency to this youth guarantee, which actually should provide young people with a quality of employment, is as mentioned there. So basically under the austerity rules and fiscal conditionality, actually the lender countries or lenders also pushed some member states actually to readjust and to lower the standards of how young work is protected. This may be the only way in how I relate today also to the protection of young work. But this pillar has also been abandoned. So basically what we're left is what is acclaimed in political discourse are these 2 means, the European Youth Guarantee and the Youth Employment Initiative, which now is carried over in the next generation EU funding and the multi-annual financial framework. So those 2 things are left there. But are they really that new? And that's actually what I kind of look at the paper in the end. And just to go back to this point, I just want to briefly outline the history of the European Youth Guarantee, because what is actually interesting is that this Youth Guarantee is not this major change. It has not been invented in 2013 when it was introduced. So basically, first traces of such a guarantee, providing an alternative offer to unemployment to young persons in EU discourse, are to be found in 1981 in a document by the Commission, where the Commission kind of sets out its priorities for the 80s, and there was also a big youth unemployment crisis there, and how actually the employment policy of the EEC then still should look like in the 80s. And they also have this discourse, we want to provide an alternative offer to young persons within a certain time limit. So this is the first time. It was then not adopted, but the idea is out there. In 1997, the European Council takes up the idea again, and then it's basically linking back also to what Christiana said before, in its employment guidelines then, they were still done by the European Council then, it was actually the first employment guidelines, if I'm not mistaken. They call for a so-called New Start guarantee, which is basically the same as the European Youth Guarantee, and just providing young people with an offer within 6 months instead of 4 months. There's also some minor differences, but basically the idea is there now and has been adopted by the member states in this regard, by the European Council. But what is interesting to see is actually that it's still not truly within the competences of the European Union, because the European Council just adopted this in its conclusions and called upon the member states to implement this, but it's not truly linked to the European Union's legal order in itself. And this is, I think, what is really the major change of 2013 and of the European Youth Guarantee is actually that by being a Council recommendation, this guarantee, the idea which was out there for a long time, has not been implemented maybe, but the idea was there. But now the idea is drawn into the framework of the European Union's legal order by being a Council recommendation, and in this sense could actually lead to further increases of the European Union's activity in youth employment policy. And what is quite interesting to see is that in 2020 with COVID-19 as well, was already foreseen before, but now it actually also was proposed, the Commission issued a proposal for a reformed European Youth Guarantee, which, however, quite interesting to know, because this is something very legalistic now, but the 2013 guarantee was not based upon one of the European Union's competences that I outlined before, but just upon the Council's power to adopt recommendations, which is a very strange procedure to any EU lawyer. But then in 2020, the renewed guarantee was actually proposed by the Commission. It's still not adopted, but it was proposed upon the European Union's competences in employment policy. And if this would be taken over, actually probably youth employment policy would now be or become a true feature of what the European Union can do under employment policy. And this is kind of also the conclusion that I want to give for this paper now, is that actually these mechanisms for youth employment policy that the EU has, the EU definitely has them by now, but they're not, as I said before, the result of revolutions or major changes in the last decade, but they're the result of historical contingencies that might have the potential to also alter how the European Union deals with employment policy in general in the future. And maybe we'll actually witness a kind of gradual strengthening of the European Union in dealing with youth employment in the next years. So basically, this was the idea of the paper, and I thank you very much for the fact also that it finally has functioned here. So,
Marc, thank you very, very much.